Number 1. The Atacama Humanoid. In 2003, a man named Oscar Munoz was searching an abandoned nitrate mining town called La Noria, deep in the Atacama Desert of Chile. Behind a ruined church, he found something wrapped in white cloth and tied with a violet ribbon. Inside was a tiny skeleton. It was only about 15 centimeters long, roughly 6 inches, small enough to rest in the palm of your hand. And yet it was fully formed. It had hardened teeth. It had a strange cone-shaped skull stretched to a point. When people counted its ribs, they seemed to find only 10 pairs, where a human has 12. That was all it took. The story spread that this was not human at all, that it was proof of something visiting us. The little body was sold, then moved to Spain, into the private collection of a businessman named Ramon Navia Osorio. It never entered a public museum, and that matters, because a private owner answers to no one. In 2013, a UFO filmmaker named Stephen Greer put the specimen at the center of a documentary called Sirius, and the legend went global. But then real scientists asked for the DNA. At Stanford University, an immunologist named Gary Nolan led a full genome study, published in the journal Genome Research in March of 2018, working with Atul Butte at the University of California, San Francisco. Nolan expected to expose a hoax. Instead, he found high-quality human DNA. The result was clear. Ada was human. Ada was female. Ada's ancestry was local, Andean, Chilean, not alien, not ancient. The genome told a heartbreaking story. It carried mutations in at least 7 genes, with names like COL1A1 and FLNB and PCNT, all tied to dwarfism and severe skeletal disorders. The bones had matured so fast that the body looked like a child of 6 or 8 years old. But this was a fetus, or a newborn. Geneticists still argue over whether that cluster of 7 mutations describes one single disorder, or a run of terrible bad luck stacked in one small body. And the death was recent, within roughly the last 40 years, some estimates as recent as the 1970s. The whole specimen weighs only a few grams. You could hide it in a matchbox, which is part of how it slipped so easily onto the collector market in the first place. Do you see what that means? This was not a discovery. This was a modern miscarriage, a human infant, likely taken illegally from a grave. Chile's National Monuments Council said exactly that. A bioethicist named Xian Halcrow condemned the whole study for treating a recent human child as a curiosity, without consent, without context. The pointed skull was simply the natural molding of a premature infant's soft head, dried hard by the driest desert on Earth. No ethical museum will ever display Ata, and the reason is not a cover-up. The reason is shame. So what happens when the same trick is played, but with bodies that are genuinely ancient? Number 2. The Nazca Tridactyl Mummies. In 2017, near the town of Nazca in Peru, a set of bodies appeared online. They were promoted by a Peruvian journalist named Jaime Maussan through a streaming platform. The largest, nicknamed Maria, was about 1.6 meters tall, with a human-like skeleton, but each hand ended in only 3 long fingers. Each foot had 3 toes. The skull was stretched into a dome, and the whole body was coated in a white powder, diatomaceous earth, which both preserves flesh and hides what is underneath. To believers, these were aliens, finally caught. In November of 2023, Maussan carried 2 of the small bodies into the Mexican Congress and laid them before lawmakers. The images went around the world, and the world laughed. But the truth underneath is far darker than a joke. Peru's own College of Biologists denounced the mummies. A forensic archaeologist named Elsa Tomasto Cagigao at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru said plainly what the specimens are. They are real human mummies, ancient ones, looted from graves, taken apart, and rebuilt into something that never lived. Someone removed fingers to leave 3. Someone reassembled bones to fake an alien. Radiocarbon dates on some of the material come back around 1,000 years old, which fits genuine ancient remains, not manufactured tissue. Peru's Ministry of Culture does not treat these as a curiosity. It treats them as evidence of a crime, the crime called huacaria, grave robbing, an assault on the nation's heritage. In early 2024, Peruvian prosecutors intercepted 3 of these mummies being smuggled through the airport in Lima, packed in cardboard boxes. Officials have said the bodies were built from the bones of children and adults. Sit with that for a moment. This is why no accredited museum on Earth will display them. To exhibit them is to reward the looters who destroyed real archaeology to make them. The radiologists who examined the promoted CT scans saw joins, adhesives, and misassembled bones. The 3-fingered hands do not match the internal bone counts in the scans. It is a fraud built on a desecration, and the Nazca region makes it possible because it sits on top of centuries of Nazca and Paracas burials, an endless supply of genuine dead for someone willing to dig them up. The investigations are still open. The bodies sit in evidence lockers and private hands, and they raise a simpler, older question. What happens to a mummy when the body itself simply vanishes? Number 3. The San Pedro Mountains Mummy. In October of 1932, 2 gold prospectors named Cecil Main and Frank Carr were blasting into rock in the San Pedro Mountains, southwest of Casper, Wyoming. The dynamite opened a small cave that had been sealed shut. Inside, sitting cross-legged with its hands in its lap, was a mummy. It was only about 14 inches tall. It had a flattened head, heavy-lidded eyes, and a broad mouth that looked almost like a grin. Its skin was dark and bronze-colored. It weighed less than a pound. The local Shoshone and Arapaho peoples had old stories of the Nimirigar, a race of tiny, aggressive little people said to live in these mountains. And here, it seemed, was one of them. The mummy, nicknamed Pedro, became a sensation. It was shown in a drugstore in Casper. It traveled to sideshows. Science took it seriously, too. In the 1950s, X-rays were taken at the University of Wyoming and examined by an anthropologist named Henry Shapiro from the American Museum of Natural History. Shapiro saw a man-like skeleton with what appeared to be a full set of adult teeth. Was it an adult, shrunk somehow, or something else? Later, a University of Wyoming biological anthropologist named George Gill offered the answer that most experts now accept. Pedro was an infant, born with an encephaly, a severe birth defect. Anencephaly can give a newborn adult-like facial proportions, which explains the grown-up face and the confusion over the teeth. It was a full-term but tragically malformed baby, likely Native American and likely old. But here is the part that keeps the case alive. Pedro disappeared. Its last known owner was a Casper businessman named Leonard Wadler, who took it to the New York area in the 1950s. After that, nothing. A reward of around $10,000 has stood for decades for anyone who can lead investigators to it. No one has claimed it. A second, smaller mummy was reportedly found later, and it too is gone. Think about what that means. We have a specimen that could be settled in an afternoon with a modern CT scanner, and we cannot find it. No museum can display Pedro, because no one knows where Pedro is. All that survives are photographs and those old X-rays. The sealed cave that needed dynamite to open still troubles people. How did a body get inside a closed chamber? The anthropologists have their answer, and it is almost certainly correct. But the empty space where the mummy should be is its own kind of horror. Sometimes the disturbing thing is not the body. It is the shape of a skull that should never have existed at all. Number 4. The Paracas elongated skulls. In 1928, the father of Peruvian archaeology, a scientist named Julio Tello, was digging on the Paracas Peninsula on the southern coast of Peru. He uncovered an enormous necropolis, a city of the dead. More than 300 mummy bundles came out of the sand at a site called Cerro, Colorado. Many of them had skulls stretched backward into long, smooth cones. They date to roughly 800 to 100 BCE, the work of the Paracas culture. Some analysts claim these skulls hold up to 25% more volume than a normal human skull, with an odd weight and shape. And so, once again, the alien story arrived. Around 2014, a fringe researcher named Brian Forster commissioned DNA tests and announced that the skulls carried mutations unknown in any human being. That claim was never peer-reviewed. It was rejected by geneticists as contamination or misreading. Legitimate DNA studies placed the Paracas people firmly within native South American ancestry. They were not hybrids. They were us. So why the strange shape? The mainstream answer is well documented across the entire world. It is intentional cranial deformation. You bind an infant's soft skull with boards and cloth over many months, and the growing head takes a new form. It changes the shape, but not the volume, and not the genetics. Cultures on nearly every continent have done it. Among the Paracas, an elongated head likely marked elite status, or group identity, or lineage. Some skulls still carry reddish and even blondish hair, which believers call impossible for the region. But hair pigment changes after death, and red hair occurs naturally in populations everywhere. The physical anthropologist Christina Kilgrove has spent years publicly dismantling the alien skull claims. And still they spread, because the skulls are genuinely strange to look at, and strangeness sells. The contested details, a supposedly missing sagittal suture, an unusual weight, an odd bump at the back of the head, almost always turn out to be normal human variation, or a side effect of the binding itself. Here is where it connects to our theme. Most of these skulls do not sit in the great display halls of the world. They are held in a small local museum and in restricted collections. Part of that is patrimony law, which makes it hard to export sensitive human remains. And part of it is deliberate. Museums do not want to hand the alien narrative a trophy case. The real story is quieter and stranger than the myth. A people wrapped their elite dead in some of the finest embroidered textiles ever made in the ancient Americas, and reshaped their children's heads to mark who they were. The dry coast preserved it all for over 2,000 years. That is the marvel. And it leads us north, to a cave in Nevada, and to a legend about giants that will not die. Number 5. The Lovelock Cave Remains. In the Humboldt Sink of northern Nevada, there is a cave called Lovelock. Starting in 1911, miners came to dig out its floor for bat guano, valuable as fertilizer. In doing so, they tore through thousands of ancient artifacts. Proper excavation came later, by L.L. Loud in 1912 and Mark Harrington in 1924. And the cave gave up something remarkable. It held some of the oldest duck decoys known anywhere on Earth, made of tule reeds, about 2,000 years old, now kept at the Smithsonian. But that is not what Lovelock is famous for. The northern Paiute people have an ancient tradition about the Site Ka, a tribe of red-haired tall enemies, said to have been trapped in a cave and burned. The story was written down by Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins in her 1883 book, Life Among the Paiutes, and from there it spread far and wide. Over time, the tale grew. Believers began to claim that giant skeletons, some 6.5 feet tall, some over 8 feet, had been pulled from Lovelock Cave, along with enormous sandals. And then, they claim, the museums made the giants disappear. Here is the truth. No giant skeleton from Lovelock has ever been scientifically documented. The Nevada State Museum and the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca have no record of them. The reddish hair on some remains is explained by natural pigment change and chemical staining from the cave over thousands of years. There is talk of an oversized pair of sandals and a large handprint on the cave wall, even a claimed 15-inch print. But the scale is disputed, and no verified giant remains exist in any real collection. So why does the story survive? partly because the cave was wrecked before scientists arrived, destroying the context that could have settled it. Partly because the Humboldt Museum reportedly does hold some red-haired remains, and has been reluctant to display them, which believers read as a cover-up. The folklorist Adrienne Mayer has studied exactly how legends like this form around real bones and oversized objects. The reluctance is real, but it comes from ethics and repatriation law, from respect for ancestral remains, not from a conspiracy to hide a race of giants. The genuine treasures of Lovelock, the ancient duck decoys, the woven textiles, the record of thousands of years of northern Paiute ancestors, are astonishing on their own. They are simply less exciting than a giant. And the Paiute descendants, whose history this is, object to seeing it flattened into a monster movie. Now we cross into South America again, to tombs that no museum could ever move, because they were built to be unreachable. Number 6. The Sarcophagi of Karajía. High on a sheer cliff near the village of Cruzpada, in the Utcubamba Valley of northern Peru, a row of figures stands watching the gorge below. From a distance, they look like tall people. Up close, they are tombs. They were built by the Chachapoya, the people the Inca called the warriors of the clouds, around the 15th century CE, before the Inca ever reached them. Each one is called a Puran Machu, and they stand up to 2.5 meters tall, about 8 feet, made of clay, sticks, grass, and stone over a wooden frame. They are shaped like standing humans, with oversized heads, painted in white, ochre, and red, and on top of several of them sit real human skulls. Imagine that. A clay giant in the shape of a person with an actual human skull crowning its head, staring out over the valley. Inside each figure, an elite member of the community was placed in a seated, fetal position, mummified and wrapped. Why put them here, on a cliff face hundreds of feet up? Because it was unreachable. The Chachapoya placed their most important dead where no grave robber and no enemy could climb. It worked. While Chachapoya sites elsewhere have been savagely looted, Karajía survived, protected by nothing but the drop beneath it. The site was scientifically documented in 1984 by the Peruvian archaeologist Federico Kaufmann Doig. There were once 8 of these figures standing in a row. At some point in the past, an earthquake shook several of them loose from the ledge and sent them shattering into the gorge. Only a handful remain today, and their survival at all is a kind of accident of geology. And here is the point for our story. These tombs can never enter a museum. They are fused to the cliff. You cannot lift them, cannot move them, cannot bring them indoors without destroying them. They can only be seen from a distance, exactly as their makers intended. The Chachapoya were remarkable builders. They razed the vast fortress of Cuelap and carved cliff tombs across the region. Spanish chroniclers describe them as unusually tall and fair-skinned, a detail that later fed a great deal of pseudo-history, though it rests on thin evidence. The skulls on top remain a genuine mystery. Are they trophy heads, taken from enemies? Are they revered ancestors, kept close? Scholars still debate it. What is not in doubt is the feeling the site gives you. Faded red and cream paint still clings to the figures. They face outward, like guardians, over the land of the living. The Chachapoya themselves were absorbed by the Inca in the late 15th century, and then devastated by Old World disease after the Spanish came. Their guardians remain, watching an empty valley. From tombs built to be seen forever, we turn to a body a museum chose to hide, in the middle of a modern city. Number 7. Brea Woman. In the middle of Los Angeles, there are pools of black asphalt that have been swallowing animals for tens of thousands of years. The La Brea tar pits have preserved an entire Ice Age world. Dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, mammoths, millions of bones in total. And in all of that, across all those millennia, only one human being has ever been found. She was recovered in 1914 from a spot called Pit 10. We call her La Brea Woman. Her partial skeleton, including her skull and jaw, is dated to roughly 10,000 years old, at the very start of our current era, the Holocene. She was young, somewhere between about 17 and 25 years old, and short, around 4 feet 8 to 4 feet 11 inches tall. She was found with a domestic dog and with grinding stones, a matat. That association with a dog is quietly important because it speaks to how long dogs have lived beside people on this continent, and her skull shows a possible injury. Some researchers have suggested she may have suffered a blow, that she may even have been the victim of a homicide 10,000 years ago. The tar itself had stained her bones a deep, distinctive brown, the same asphalt that swallowed the mammoths and the saber-toothed cats around her. For years, the museum on the site, once called the Page Museum, now the La Brea Tar Pits Museum, displayed a reconstruction of her, including a rotating hologram that faded between her face and her skull. Visitors met her eyes. Then, in 2004, she was quietly removed from display. The reason was a growing recognition that showing Native American human remains for entertainment was wrong. The 1990 law known as NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, had reshaped how institutions think about the dead in their care. Today, her actual bones are kept in the collections, not on public view. Access is restricted. She is understood now as an ancestor of early Native Californians, connected to the indigenous peoples of the Los Angeles Basin, deserving of respect rather than a spotlight. Her scientific value is enormous. She is the only human in one of the richest fossil sites on the continent. Her association with a dog speaks to how long dogs have lived beside people in the Americas. The debate over her injury, violence, or simply damage during entrapment and excavation has never been fully resolved, and ongoing digs at the site, in deposits known as Project 23, keep pulling new Ice Age material from the ground near where she was found. There may yet be a second human somewhere in the tar, waiting in the black asphalt to be found, but the first one is no longer shown. Her removal is a clear, documented choice, a museum deciding not to display what it once did. And there is one case that made that choice into a national battle, fought over 9,000 years and a single skeleton. Number 8. Kennewick Man. On the 28th of July, 1996, two young men watching a boat race stumbled on a skull in the shallows of the Columbia River, near Kennewick, Washington. What they found turned out to be one of the oldest and most complete skeletons ever discovered in North America, about 8,500 to 9,000 years old. An anthropologist named James Chatters made an early reconstruction and made an early mistake. He described the skull as, in his word, Caucasoid. That single word set off 20 years of conflict. Because if the oldest Americans were not related to Native Americans, then the entire story of who belongs to this land could be rewritten. Fringe writers seized on it to claim Europeans reached the Americas first. Buried in the man's hip was a stone spear point, healed over, proof he had survived a serious wound. But the real fight was not about his life. It was about his body. 5 Northwest tribes, including the Umatilla, called him the Ancient One and asked for him to be reburied as their ancestor, under Nagpare. A group of 8 scientists, led by Douglas Owsley of the Smithsonian, sued for the right to study him. In 2004, in the case Bonnickson versus United States, the scientists won access. Owsley's team argued from the shape of the bones that the Ancient One resembled the Ainu of Japan, or Polynesians, more than modern Native Americans. And then the DNA spoke. In 2015, a team led by the geneticist Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen published the result in the journal Nature. Kennewick Man was most closely related to modern Native Americans, including the Colville tribe of the region. the tribes had been right all along. The morphology had been wrong. The claim of ancient Europeans collapsed. In February of 2017, the Ancient One was repatriated and reburied at a secret location by a coalition of Columbia Basin tribes. And that is the crucial fact. He can never be studied again. He can never be displayed. The most important early skeleton on the continent is back in the earth on purpose. Isotopes in his bones had suggested a diet from the sea, hinting he traveled or lived near the coast. He stood about 5 feet 7, muscular, marked by a lifetime of injuries. The Army Corps of Engineers had even buried his discovery site under tons of rock in 1998, destroying its context. His story is now taught everywhere as the turning point in how this country treats its most ancient dead. And one museum turned that same reckoning into a single, unforgettable room. Number 9. The Dickson Mounds Burial Exhibit. Near Lewistown, Illinois, in the valley of the Illinois River, there's a place called Dickson Mounds. In 1927, a chiropractor and amateur archaeologist named Don Dickson began excavating burials on his own family's land. But he did something that would haunt the site for decades. He did not remove the skeletons. He left them exactly where they lay, in the earth, and built a museum over the top of them. Then he opened the doors to the public. Inside, visitors looked down on roughly 230 exposed Native American skeletons, still in their original burial positions, curled in the soil. These were the dead of a Mississippian farming society. People who lived here between about 900 and 1250 CE, part of the wider world of Cahokia. In 1945, the site became a state museum, and for decades, the open graves drew crowds of tourists. By the 1980s, that had become intolerable. Native American activists and organizations demanded the display be closed, calling it exactly what it was, a desecration. The exhibit turned into a national flashpoint, a public argument about whether it is ever acceptable to put indigenous dead on show. In 1990, Congress passed NAGPRA. And in Illinois, the governor, Jim Edgar, ordered the burial display closed. On the 25th of November, 1991, the graves were sealed and covered. Native leaders held ceremonies as their ancestors were finally given back their rest. The Dickson Mounds Museum still exists today, but it tells the story of Mississippian life through interpretive exhibits with no visible human remains. This is the most literal case on our entire list. A museum that once made its name by displaying the dead chose, deliberately, to stop and to bury them again. Before the closure, studies of those skeletons had produced genuinely important science. Researchers used them to trace the health of a Mississippian population and found something striking. As these people shifted to intensive maize agriculture and packed into denser settlements, rates of disease and malnutrition rose. The bones themselves recorded the hidden price of that new way of living, written in the enamel of their teeth and the scars on their joints. The bones recorded the hidden cost of that way of life. That knowledge is real, and it is valuable. But it was bought at a price the descendants never agreed to pay. Don Dickson's original motive was a mix of curiosity, showmanship, and early science. The reversal of his exhibit, from headline attraction to sealed ground, marks how far a nation's conscience can move, and it leaves one final case, the oldest of them all, where the dead are not hidden by law, but by their own fragility, and by the sheer weight of time. Number 10. The Chinchorro Mummies. Long before Egypt, on the desert coast where northern Chile meets southern Peru, a people called the Chinchorro were doing something no one else on earth had done. They were mummifying their dead on purpose. The oldest of their artificial mummies are around 7,000 years old, with the practice beginning near 5,000 BCE. That is roughly 2,000 years before the first Egyptian mummies. And the Chinchorro were not kings or priests with vast tombs. They were hunter-gatherers and fishers, people without pottery, without writing, without monuments. What they did to their dead is difficult to hear. In the earliest style, the black mummies, made between about 5000 and 3000 BCE, they took the body completely apart. They removed the skin. They removed the organs. They reinforced the skeleton with sticks and reeds. They packed the body, reattached the skin, and coated the whole thing in black manganese paint. Then they gave it a face, a molded clay mask, and often a short wig of human hair. Later, in the red mummies, from around 2500 BCE, they made incisions, stuffed the body, reassembled it, and painted it with red ochre, leaving the face black. And they did this for everyone: men, women, the elderly, and, in disproportionate numbers, infants and unborn children. That detail tells you what this really was. It was grief. A people facing terrible child mortality, refusing to let their smallest dead simply vanish. Some bodies were repainted and repaired over generations, kept among the living, cared for like heirlooms. The German archaeologist Max Uhle first documented them scientifically in 1917, near the city of Arica. Today, thousands of Chinchorro remains exist, with a major collection at the San Miguel de Azapa Museum, run by the University of Tarapacá. In 2021, the Chinchorro sites were recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Listing, honored as the earliest known artificial mummification on the planet. So why are they so rarely on open display? 2 reasons, and both belong to our theme. The first is fragility. The extreme dryness of the Atacama created them and preserved them for millennia. But as humidity has risen, some museum-held mummies have begun to degrade, turning, alarmingly, into a black ooze. Conservators raised the alarm around 2015, with help from a Harvard microbiologist named Ralph Mitchell. Many mummies now live in climate-controlled storage, not in the light. The second reason is reverence. To stand before a wall of reassembled human dead, 7,000 years old, flayed and rebuilt by grieving hands, is not entertainment. It is something closer to prayer. And that brings us to the harder question underneath all 10 of these stories. Look back across everything we have seen, and a pattern emerges. When we say a museum refuses to display something, we imagine a conspiracy, a locked vault, a secret being kept from us. But the real reasons these finds vanish fall into 4 plain categories, and only one of them is even a little sinister. The first is ethics and law. Brea Woman, Kennewick Man, and the dead of Dickson Mounds were removed to respect native ancestors and to follow the law. The second is fragility. The Chinchorro mummies and the Paracas remains are too delicate or too close to falling apart for an open gallery. The third is physical impossibility. The Sarcophagi of Karajía are fused to a cliff and can never be moved indoors at all. The fourth category is the interesting one. Pseudoscience contamination. The Nazca mummies, the Paracas skulls, the Lovelock remains, all kept back in part so that no institution accidentally hands a trophy case to a false story about aliens or giants. And there is a fifth thread that runs quietly through several of these cases, one that is harder to talk about. Again and again, the bodies at the center of the sensation are the most vulnerable of all. The infant the malformed newborn called Pedro, the overrepresented infants and unborn children of the Chinchorro. The pattern is not a coincidence. Grief and defect, and death in the very young are exactly the things that produce a body, strange enough to be mistaken for something inhuman. Notice something. The most sensational specimens are not held by museums at all. Sat in a private collection. The Nazca mummies sit in evidence lockers and private hands. The famous Smithsonian cover-up of the giants has never produced a single documented specimen, because there is none. The bodies the public most wants to see are precisely the ones science has the least to do with. And when a museum does step back, it is almost always an act of care. Reburial, in the case of the ancient one, is the ultimate version of that. The object simply ceases to exist for the public, forever. The mystery quietly shifts. It stops being, what is it? And it becomes why we chose to stop looking. To understand 3 of these stories, you have to understand one law. NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990. In plain terms, it requires institutions that receive federal funding to inventory the Native American remains and sacred objects in their collections, and to return them to descendant communities. It did something profound. It reclassified human remains, from artifacts, from specimens, into ancestors. People owed consultation, and often a return to the earth. That single shift is what closed the hologram of Brea Woman in 2004. It is what sent the ancient one back into the ground in 2017. Dickson Mounds, closed in 1991, moved in the same spirit, even a little ahead of it. Before these changes, displaying native dead was common, and it was profitable. The Kennewick case became the great test of a hard question. How do you prove that a 9,000-year-old skeleton is affiliated with a living tribe? For years, the shape of the bones was used to argue he was not. Then, in 2015, DNA settled it, and the balance tipped decisively toward the tribes. Repatriation can take several forms. It can mean reburial in the earth, as with the ancient one. It can mean transfer to a tribe. It can mean the remains stay in a collection, but under the direction of the descendant community, cared for on their terms rather than the museum's. The effect has spread far beyond these cases. Museums across the country have removed or covered thousands of remains. In 2023 and 2024, major institutions, including the American Museum of Natural History, closed entire halls while they worked to comply. Critics warn that science loses irreplaceable data every time a skeleton goes back into the ground. Supporters answer that dignity and sovereignty matter more than a display case. The argument is not settled, and it is not only American. Chile and Peru assert the same rights over their dead. What used to be a curator's choice is now, very often, a legal and moral obligation. That reframes every single item on this list. There is a machine that turns real anomalies into false stories. And once you see it working, you cannot unsee it. It runs on a simple fuel. Take something genuinely strange, a deformed skull, a tiny mummy, a tuft of red hair on ancient remains, and offer the most exciting possible explanation. Cranial deformation is real, practiced worldwide, but recast it as alien engineering. A birth defect like anencephaly or dwarfism becomes a tiny extraterrestrial. Pigment that changed after death becomes proof of a lost non-native race. Media platforms and documentaries monetize that gap between the strange fact and the sober answer. The journalist behind the Nazca mummies has a decades-long history of debunked alien reveals, and the pattern simply repeats. There is a cruel irony hidden in the debunking itself. Every time a scientist steps forward to correct the record, the correction spreads the original claim a little further. The myth feeds on the very attention meant to kill it, which is one reason these stories never seem to die. But this is not harmless entertainment. The alien mummy trade gives looters a financial reason to tear apart genuine Nazca and Paracas graves. The claim that museums are hiding the truth feeds on the real fact that remains are, indeed, kept out of view for entirely different reasons. And when a body vanishes, like Pedro, speculation grows without limit because there is nothing left to test. Against all of this stand the scientists, Gary Nolan, Christina Kilgrove, the folklorist Adrienne Mayer, patiently showing the evidence. The fringe answer often points to unpublished DNA that never survives peer review. And the strange thing is that the true story is almost always more astonishing than the myth. a 7,000-year-old body, rebuilt by grieving hands, is more moving than any alien. The real skill this whole subject demands is the ability to hold two things at once: genuine wonder at what these people made, and firm refusal to let that wonder be used to fund the destruction of their graves. Curiosity is healthy. Credulity that pays looters is not. For all of that, the mysteries do not simply close. Debunk the aliens, follow the law, and real questions still stand open. We do not know Ada's exact condition, whether those 7 mutated genes describe a single syndrome or a cruel accident of chance. We do not know where Pedro is, and finding that little mummy could resolve its whole story in an afternoon under a modern scanner. We do not truly know why the Chinchorro began mummifying their dead 2,000 years before anyone else on Earth. We do not know for certain whether Brea Woman was murdered or simply damaged after death. We do not know how a body came to rest in a sealed Wyoming cave. We cannot say for sure what the skulls on the Sarcophagi of Karajía were meant to signify, trophies or ancestors. We do not fully understand why the Spanish described the Chachapoya as tall and fair. The complete genetic portrait of the Paracas people is still not fully published. We do not know whether any genuine anomaly might hide among the looted Nazca remains, now scrambled beyond recovery. And by design, we will never know the resting places of the ancestors who have been reburied. There is a deeper unknown too. How many sensitive remains still sit, unstudied, in the storage rooms of the world's museums? What the changing climate will finally do to the Chinchorro mummies. Whether new DNA methods might read a skeleton one last time before reburial closes the door for good. Every display that goes dark leaves a gap that science cannot revisit. The line between honoring the dead and losing knowledge is still being drawn, case by case. These mysteries persist, not because we failed to look, but because more and more we chose respect over spectacle. Here is the thread that runs through all 10. None of these finds was truly disturbing for what it was. Each was disturbing for what we did with it. A cone-skulled infant from the Atacama and a tiny mummy from Wyoming were turned into sideshows, then finally reclaimed by science and conscience. Ancient dead near Nazca and Paracas were torn apart to sell a fantasy. A people's own oral history at Lovelock was flattened into a giant myth that erased them. The Chachapoya placed their dead beyond our reach, and we have, at last, learned to leave them there. In Los Angeles, in Washington State, in an Illinois river valley, a country slowly taught itself to see remains not as specimens, but as ancestors. And along a desert coast, the Chinchorro left us the oldest proof we have that grief and love are older than any civilization, older than writing, older than the wheel. When we say a museum refuses to display these things, we usually mean something better than fear. We mean a kind of growing up. These finds move from the public shelf to the storage room to the ground. We bury them twice, and what we choose to hide reveals our values just as sharply as what we choose to show. The alien and the giant were never really about the bones. They were about us, about our hunger for wonder and our distrust of the people who guard the past. Respect and curiosity were never enemies. The best science holds both at once. The unseen, it turns out, can teach us more than the exhibited ever could. These bodies do not ask to be gawked at. They ask to be understood. Deep time and recent grief meet in the same desert dust. And every one of us, in the end, is a future find.